Hello, neighbors. Before we get into the episode, just a couple quick things I'd like to mention. If you go to the podcast website, neighborontheleft.com, there's a whole bunch of things for you to check out there, including the contacts page, where you can see all of the social media links. And these days, I do post a lot of stuff just about daily on Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook. A lot of interesting stuff there. If you stop by, please like, share, and follow if you would. Also on the website, there is the episodes section where you can download or stream any episode of the podcast going all the way back to the beginning. And of course, the blog section. I make a post for every episode of the podcast, and it includes all of the sources that I use. All right, let's start the episode. Looking around and paying attention these days makes me always think of this one particular question. How much evidence does it take before people are willing to admit there is a pattern? Not proof beyond every imaginable doubt, not a signed confession, not Donald Trump standing behind a podium and saying, yes, I did it, and here's the itemized receipt. But just enough evidence to make an honest person stop and say, all right, something here just doesn't smell right. Something deserves a closer look. Because that is the part I keep getting hung up on. A story comes out involving access, money, favors, business interest, pardons, investigations, inspectors general, or government power being used in ways that benefit the president, his family, his friends, or his political allies. And almost immediately, the defenses arrive. Oh, it's fake news. Everybody does it. He's just a really good businessman. Joe Biden was worse. Nothing illegal happened. And sometimes those answers contradict one another. It cannot simultaneously be fake news, completely normal, brilliant business strategy, and justified because other people did something worse. But somehow every road leads to exactly the same destination. Trump did nothing wrong. And that raises a question bigger than any one particular scandal. How do intelligent people defend conduct that they would ordinarily condemn? How does someone who understands conflicts of interest in business suddenly become confused by them in government? How does someone who believes public officials should be accountable decide that accountability itself is a partisan attack? And how many exceptions can you carve into a principle before it stops being a principle? Now, I'm not asking you to accept every accusation made against Trump. I'm not asking you to assume every questionable action is a crime, and I'm not asking you to pretend corruption began in 2017. Politicians have always tested ethical boundaries. Some have blown right past them. Some have sprinted across them carrying a suitcase full of campaign donations and yelling, "Catch me if you can." But scale matters, and patterns matter. And most importantly, standards matter. Because if the exact same conduct would have Republicans calling for hearings or subpoenas, investigations, resignations, possibly a public hanging on the Capitol lawn, if it was Joe Biden or Kamala Harris, then we're no longer debating the conduct. We're debating who's allowed to do it. So today's episode isn't really about Donald Trump. It's about standards. Hello, neighbors. Happy Monday, and welcome to Your Neighbor on the Left, the podcast about progressive politics, human decency, and a life on the blue side of America's ideological divide. My name is Don Spielis, your host, and today we're going to talk about corruption, or more specifically, excusing corruption. We're going to look at a timeline that was used by Senator Chris Murphy of what he calls corruption during the Trump administration. Let me pause right here and mention that I have posted this timeline to the podcast website, neighborontheLeft.com. If you would like, you can pause the episode and go there to see the entire timeline. It's posted in the blog section of the site. Now, it's not absolutely necessary, but it can help put things in better perspective. Okay, so now this episode is not asking you to accept Murphy's conclusion simply because he's a Democratic senator, and it's not asking you to treat every item on that timeline as equally serious. What I want to do is establish a standard, examine the evidence, and then ask whether that standard changes depending on whose name is attached. Because corruption is not always a cash-filled envelope sliding across a restaurant table. Sometimes it's access, sometimes it's influence, sometimes it's government power quietly bending toward private benefit. And sometimes the most revealing part is not the conduct itself, it's how quickly people decide they would rather defend the person than examine what happened. So before we start talking about Chris Murphy's timeline, before we start naming examples or arguing over whether this story or that story is fair, we need to agree on the rules. Because if we don't agree on the standard first, then every example just turns into another political argument. One side says this proves corruption and the other side says no, it doesn't. And round we go. So let's define what we're actually talking about. When most people hear the word corruption, they picture something straight out of a mob movie. A politician accepts a suitcase full of cash. A contractor wins a government bid because somebody got paid off. A public official literally sells a vote. And those things certainly qualify as corruption, but it's far from the only kinds. Corruption exists on a spectrum. Some actions are clearly criminal. Others are perfectly legal while still raising profound ethical concerns. Those aren't the same thing. And confusing them is one of the easiest ways to derail the conversation. Let's start with the easiest category, illegal conduct. That's the part the courts deal with. Did someone violate a criminal statute? Can prosecutors prove it beyond a reasonable doubt? Were all the legal elements met? Those are important questions, just not the only question. Because government ethics were never intended to stop at the edge of the criminal code. I mean, think about your own workplace, wherever it is that you happen to work. Suppose your boss hires his daughter. Maybe she's genuinely qualified. Maybe no company rule prohibits it. It's not illegal, but people are still going to ask whether everyone else received a fair opportunity. Now imagine he awards a lucrative contract to his golfing buddy. Again, maybe everything technically followed company policy, but people are going to wonder whether the decision was based on merit or relationships. And those questions aren't unreasonable. They're exactly the kinds of questions ethical standards are designed to encourage. Public service works the same way. Government isn't just expected to avoid crimes. It's held to a higher standard. It's expected to avoid conflicts that undermine public confidence. Which brings us to another important distinction. A conflict of interest doesn't necessarily mean somebody actually acted improperly. It means the public responsibilities and the private interests of this person are pulling in different directions. Imagine a city council member voting on whether to build a new highway that just happens to increase the value of property that he owns. Maybe he votes because he honestly believes the project benefits the community. Maybe he's right. But the conflict still exists. That's why so many ethics rules require officials to disclose financial interest or remove themselves from certain decisions. Not because they're automatically guilty, but appearances matter, which brings us to something people often roll their eyes at. The appearance of impropriety. I've heard people dismiss that phrase as political correctness. I think it's one of the smartest ideas in government, because government relies on public trust, and public trust is fragile. If people reasonably begin to wonder whether officials are enriching themselves, rewarding their friends, or using public office for private advantage, confidence starts eroding whether or not anyone ever gets convicted of anything. Government depends on legitimacy, and legitimacy depends on trust. And trust depends on people believing the rules apply to everyone equally. Now let's talk about another phrase that you'll hear today: self-dealing. That's simply using public office in ways that create personal financial benefit. Sometimes it's illegal, sometimes it isn't. Sometimes it falls into gray areas that ethics experts argue about for years. But again, legal isn't always the same thing as ethical. Think about it this way. If your financial advisor legally steered your retirement money into investments owned by his own family without telling you, would your first response really be, well, I guess if it's technically not a crime? Probably not. You'd probably find another financial advisor. Because most of us understand that ethics demand more than merely staying on the legal side of the line. Now, that's the framework that I'd like to use today. Not, can a prosecutor win, but would this concern us if someone from the other party had done it? That's a much tougher question, but it's also a much fairer question. Because if the answer changes depending on whether the headline includes the name Trump or Biden or Harris or Obama or Bush or Reagan, then we aren't evaluating the conduct, we're evaluating the team. And once that starts happening, accountability becomes almost impossible. So before we look at Senator Chris Murphy's timeline, before we talk about some of the examples in there, let's agree on one rule. The question isn't whether every accusation is true. The question is whether we're willing to apply the same standard to everyone. If we can do that, then we're finally ready to have an honest conversation. One of the most common defenses you'll hear whenever corruption comes up is this: everybody does it. All politicians are corrupt. Both parties are the same. They're all crooks. And I understand why that argument feels satisfying. It lets you skip the hard work. You don't have to examine what happened. You don't have to compare evidence. You don't have to decide whether one case is more serious than another. You just throw every politician into the same rusty dumpster, light a match, and go home feeling worldly. But everybody does it is not analysis. It's simply surrender. Because even when two people engage in conduct that belongs in the same general category, scale still matters. Imagine a teenager stealing candy from a convenience store. That's theft. Now think about Bernie Madoff stealing billions of dollars from thousands of people. That's also theft. Technically, both statements are true. But if someone said, well, stealing is stealing, they're basically the same, you would assume they had either lost their mind or were, Bernie Madoff's attorney. The category is the same. The scale is not. Intent matters. Frequency matters. Consequences matter. The size of the benefit matters. The number of people harmed matters. Patterns matter. The same principle can apply to speeding. A person driving 6 miles over the limit on an empty highway is technically breaking the law. A person driving 120 miles an hour through a school zone is also breaking the law. Now, nobody with functioning judgment treats those actions as morally or practically equivalent. But in politics, people suddenly pretend proportionality is some exotic mathematical theory recently discovered by CERN. One politician accepts a questionable gift, another repeatedly creates opportunities for donors and allies and family members or personal businesses to benefit from government decisions. And the response is, well, they all do it. No. They may all belong in the category of ethical concern. That does not make them equal. This is where Donald Trump's refusal to accept the presidential salary often enters the conversation. And let's be fair about it. Trump did donate his presidential salary during his first term. That amounted to roughly $400,000 a year. If somebody wants to point that out as a good gesture, fine. I'm not going to twist myself into a pretzel pretending otherwise. However, the gesture does not answer the larger ethical question. Leaving $400,000 on the table does not erase substantially larger opportunities for financial benefit created by holding the office. If a public official foregoes one visible stream of income while maintaining businesses and licensing arrangements and promotional opportunities and paid access and or financial products whose value may rise because of his political power, then pointing to the salary is not a defense. It's just accounting with one eye closed. Imagine your financial advisor saying to you, well, yes, I directed millions of dollars into companies connected with my family, but I waived the $50 consultation fee. Would you call that evidence of selflessness? Or would you wonder why he keeps talking about the $50? The salary defense works because the number is easy to understand. The president gets paid, Trump gave the money away or didn't take the money, case closed. But public corruption is rarely that tidy. The most valuable benefits of political power are often indirect. A brand becomes more prominent. A property becomes a gathering place for people seeking influence. Access becomes valuable. Licensing opportunities expand. New ventures gain attention that they could never purchase through ordinary advertising. President does not need to receive a paper bag full of cash in the Oval Office for the office to create immense private financial advantages. That doesn't automatically prove wrongdoing. It does mean the full picture cannot be reduced to a donated paycheck. And this is exactly why everybody does it is such a useful defense. It just flattens everything. It takes every ethical concern from minor to enormous and presses it into the same gray pancake. Once everything is equally corrupt, nothing is especially corrupt. Once everyone's guilty, then no one has to be accountable. Now, that may feel cynical, but it's actually remarkably convenient for the people with the most to explain. So yeah, politicians should be scrutinized. Democrats too. I would say I would like to see Democrats scrutinized more so because they're getting my support. Joe Biden should be held to ethical standards. Kamala Harris should be held to ethical standards. Members of Congress, governors, judges, cabinet officials, and presidents should all face the same questions. But applying the same standard does not mean pretending every case produces the same answer. Equal scrutiny is not equal judgment. The facts still have to matter, and the scale still has to matter, and the pattern still has to matter. And once we agree on that, we can finally stop hiding behind the everybody does it excuse and start examining what actually happened. Because Senator Chris Murphy's timeline is not a single accusation. It's an argument about accumulation. And accumulation is where isolated explanations begin to look like a pattern. So Senator Murphy calls it 500 Days of Corruption. That's the title of this graphic. And before we get into examples, I want to be very clear about what I am and am not asking you to accept. I'm not saying that every item on Murphy's timeline deserves equal weight. I'm not saying that every item independently proves corruption. And I am definitely not saying a Democratic senator's accusation should just simply be treated as a verdict carved into stone because it's a senator. Murphy is making an argument. He's saying that if you pull back far enough to see these events together, they stop looking like unrelated controversies and start looking like a governing system built around money access, loyalty, and private benefit. So let's examine a few of the strongest examples. We'll start with oversight. In April of 2025, Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche issued a memo ending several Justice Department investigations into cryptocurrency companies and dismantling the department's specialized crypto enforcement team. Now, Murphy's concern was not simply that the administration changed enforcement policy. Administrations do that, although I think many people would say dismantling the crypto enforcement team was a bad move in any scenario. But Murphy's concern was that Blanche reportedly held significant cryptocurrency investments himself while working for a president whose family had developed major financial interest in the crypto industry. Now, a supporter might say the Biden administration was hostile to cryptocurrency and Trump was simply correcting that policy. Okay, fine. That is an argument about regulation, but it doesn't erase the conflict of interest question. When the people weakening oversight are personally invested in the industry receiving less oversight, you don't need a criminal indictment to recognize why an ethics alarm might start making that unpleasant chirping noise. Then there is the administration's decision to abandon a proposed rule aimed at reducing salmonella contamination in poultry. According to Murphy, Pilgrim's Pride donated $5 million to Trump's inauguration, requested that the rule be withdrawn, and got what it wanted. Now, there may be policy arguments against the rule. Maybe the industry believed it was expensive or ineffective or poorly designed. That's not the point. The point is the sequence. A company gives an unusually large donation. The company asks for a specific government action, and the administration provides that action. That doesn't automatically prove a bribe, but it is exactly the kind of arrangement that would have Republicans performing full forensic autopsies on the Biden family Christmas cards if the names were reversed. Pardon power creates an even uglier set of questions. Murphy points to the case of Paul Walczak, who had pleaded guilty in a tax and employment fraud case involving millions of dollars taken from workers. Walczak's mother reportedly paid $1 million to attend a fundraising event where she could meet Trump. A few weeks later, Trump granted Walczak a full pardon, including relief from the obligation to repay the money he had stolen in restitution. Now, presidents have extraordinarily broad pardon authority. The pardon itself was totally legal. That is precisely why legality alone is such a weak ethical standard. The important question is whether wealthy people can purchase proximity to the president and then receive mercy unavailable to ordinary defendants whose mothers can't afford a $1 million introduction. And if President Biden had pardoned the son of a $1 million Democratic donor 3 weeks after meeting the mother, I mean, please, Fox News would have launched a new channel devoted exclusively to the story. You would not be hearing, well, the Constitution gives him pardon authority. You would be hearing the word corruption every 12 seconds until your television started to smoke. Murphy points to another conflict involving Stephen Miller. Miller, who we all know, one of the administration's central architects of immigration policy, disclosed an investment to Palantir. ICE then awarded Palantir a contract to provide surveillance technology reportedly free of the competitive bidding process. Now, owning stock in a company that receives a government contract doesn't necessarily prove that Miller personally arranged the contract. That distinction matters. But when a senior official helps drive a massive expansion of immigration enforcement, while owning stock in a company positioned to profit from that expansion, the public has every right to ask questions. That is what a conflict of interest is. It doesn't require us to prove what happened in somebody's private conversations. The structure itself creates the concern. And then go back to the crypto. This is where the ethical fog becomes thick enough to cut. Trump and his family created and promoted cryptocurrency ventures while Trump served as president. Unlike an ordinary public company, cryptocurrency can allow buyers to move large amounts of money without providing the same transparency people expect from traditional political contributions. Murphy cited reports that Trump earned tens of millions of dollars through token sales involving entities linked with Russia, Iran, and North Korea. Those associations do not, by themselves, prove Trump knowingly accepted money from foreign governments. That is an important limitation, but the existence of a financial vehicle through which anonymous or difficult to identify foreign interests can pour money into an enterprise benefiting the sitting president is an ethical nightmare. We should not have to wait until someone finds an email with the subject line, "secret foreign bribe attached," before deciding the arrangement is ludicrous and dangerous. Murphy also highlighted the pardon of Binance founder Changpeng Zhao. Now, Zhao had pleaded guilty to federal money laundering violations connected to failures at his cryptocurrency exchange. His company was also involved in supporting ventures tied to the Trump family's crypto business. And Trump pardoned him. Again, the pardon was within the president's constitutional power. And again, that does not answer the ethical question. When a person who helped create financial opportunities for the president's family receives presidential clemency, we are entitled to ask whether public power and private benefit have become tangled. It's not partisan hysteria to ask those questions. That is the basic adult pattern of recognition. Now consider Trump's White House ballroom project. According to Murphy, more than half of the publicly identified donors to the project later received new or expanded federal contracts worth tens of billions of dollars. That statistic alone doesn't prove every contract was improper. Large corporations frequently donate to political and civic projects, and large corporations also compete for government work. However, when companies contribute to a president's personal project and then receive major federal benefits, transparency and competitive safeguards are absolutely essential. The correct response is not, well, maybe it's a coincidence. The correct response is, show us the process. Who made the decision? Were there competitive bids? Were career officials involved? Did the donor receive special access? That is what accountability looks like when your political jersey isn't covering your eyes. Murphy's timeline also includes the administration's support for Vulcan Elements, a rare earth minerals company connected to an investment firm involving Donald Trump Jr. The Pentagon reportedly took an ownership stake in the company and backed it with hundreds of millions of dollars in financing. Murphy says career officials were reluctant and that the pressure to complete the deal came from the White House. The company's valuation then rose dramatically. Now, government sometimes invests in strategic industries. Rare earth minerals are genuinely important to national security. So the existence of federal support is not inherently corrupt. The ethical question is why this company, why this arrangement, and what role, if any, did the president's son's financial interests play in the decision? Imagine Hunter Biden holding an investment in a small company, and then President Biden's Pentagon suddenly pouring hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars into it over the objections of career staff. Would Republicans tell us to wait patiently and avoid jumping to conclusions? Or would Jim Jordan already be smashing a gavel through a folding table? Murphy gives us another example involving nursing home policy. Industry executives reportedly paid for access to Trump, asked him to eliminate a federal staffing rule, and then the administration withdrew the rule. There may be legitimate arguments about whether that rule was workable, but again, concern is the pipeline. Money buys access. Access produces a request. The request becomes government policy. When the people affected by a regulation can simply purchase a private audience with the president, the policy-making process begins to resemble the customer service desk at a luxury resort. Except the merchandise, of course, is federal power. And finally, Murphy points to Trump's personal stock trading. According to Murphy's Senate remarks, Trump did not place his investments into a blind trust and personally approved individual trades while serving as president. Murphy cited an example in which Trump purchased more than $1 million in Dell stock, publicly praised the company, and later presided over the award of a $10 billion defense contract involving Dell. Now, again, that sequence does not automatically prove the contract was awarded to increase Trump's stock value, but presidents have historically taken extensive steps to prevent this exact question from arising. The purpose of a blind trust is not to punish a president for having money. It's to ensure the president cannot shape government policy while knowing precisely how those decisions may affect his personal portfolio. Without that separation, every major contract becomes a potential financial conflict. Every public endorsement raises another question. Every policy decision affecting an owned company carries a private shadow. And that is Senator Murphy's larger point. Any one of these stories might have an explanation. Some may ultimately prove more serious than others. Some may involve bad judgment rather than criminal conduct. But look at the categories. Regulators weakening oversight of industries in which officials hold investments. Donors receiving access and favorable policy. People connected to the president's business receiving pardons. Companies tied to relatives receiving federal support. Private investments intersecting with public contracts. At some point, that one has an explanation, stops being a complete response. Because the question isn't any longer whether each tree can be described individually. The question is whether we're willing to admit that we're standing in a forest. And once again, I want to go back to try the standard test. Replace President Trump with President Kamala Harris. Replace Donald Trump Jr. with Hunter Biden. Replace Republican donors with Democratic donors. Replace Trump crypto company with Biden family cryptocurrency. Would the response still be as patient? Would it still be charitable? Would people still insist that nothing counts unless a jury returns a guilty verdict? I don't believe that for a hot second. And that takes us to the next question, not whether every defense is wrong, but why the defenses keep changing while the conclusion always remains exactly the same. So we ask, why does this happen? Why can the explanation change from one controversy to the next while the conclusion remains remarkably consistent? Trump did nothing wrong. Sometimes the answer is straightforward. Some people simply never hear these stories. They live inside an information bubble where allegations against Trump are ignored or mentioned briefly or immediately reframed as another Democratic conspiracy. And when I say information bubble, I'm not talking about somebody being stupid. We all live in bubbles to some degree. We choose television networks, we choose websites and podcasts and newspapers and social media accounts that seem trustworthy to us. The problem begins when those sources stop informing an audience and start protecting it from inconvenient facts. Imagine spending 10 years being told that every investigation involving Trump is fake, every critical journalist is corrupt, every whistleblower is partisan, every prosecutor is politically motivated, and every Republican who criticizes him is secretly a Democrat. Eventually, the bubble becomes self-sealing. Any evidence from the outside of the bubble is dismissed because it came from the outside of the bubble. Any person who challenges the conclusion is treated as proof that the conspiracy is even bigger than previously believed. That's not a debate. That's an escape room with no door. But lack of information only explains part of it. Politics has also become identity. For many people, supporting Trump is no longer simply a choice made during an election. It's part of how they understand themselves. It shapes the hats they wear and the flags outside their homes and the people they trust and the businesses they support and the communities where they feel accepted. Once politics becomes identity, then criticism of the politician begins to feel like criticism of the person. You're no longer saying Trump may have acted unethically. They hear you were foolish to support him. They hear your values are corrupt, or people like you are the problem. And human beings are extraordinarily good at defending their identity. This is where motivated reasoning enters the picture. Motivated reasoning is what happens when we begin with the conclusion we want and then work backward to find the explanation that protects that conclusion. We all do this to one degree or another. A referee makes a questionable call against our team and we immediately see corruption or blindness or evidence that the league has been plotting against us since the late 70s. The same referee makes the same call against the other team, and suddenly we've developed a deep respect for the rule book. The facts didn't change, the uniform changed. That is political tribalism in miniature. When Trump is accused of benefiting financially from his office, the answer is that he's a businessman. He's a financial wizard. When a donor receives favorable treatment, the answer is that donations don't really prove anything. When someone connected to his businesses receives a pardon, the answer is that presidents have broad pardon powers. When oversight gets weakened, the answer is that government regulation was too excessive. When evidence becomes difficult to dismiss, the answer is, well, the Democrats are worse. Each defense may contain a nugget of truth. Business people do have financial interests. Donations don't automatically prove bribery. Presidents do possess pardon authority. Regulations can be excessive. Democrats can behave unethically, but notice what never happens. The evidence is never allowed to change the conclusion. The explanation changes, the conclusion doesn't. That is the warning sign. Because honest reasoning should occasionally surprise us. Sometimes the facts should force us to say, I support this guy, but this was wrong. Sometimes they should make us uncomfortable. They should require us to revise what we believed yesterday. If your reasoning process always produces the answer most flattering to your political team, you may not be analyzing evidence. You may just be manufacturing permission. And then there's the whole owning the libs part of this equation. I think this one matters more than many people admit. For some Trump supporters, the central political objective is no longer achieving a specific policy outcome. It's simply defeating, humiliating, or enraging the opposite side. If Trump does something liberals hate, that reaction becomes evidence that he must be doing something right. The anger itself is the product. The outrage is the applause meter. Under that system, corruption can become strangely irrelevant. Did the decision strengthen the country? Did it protect taxpayers? Did it serve the public? Those are great questions, but they get replaced with, did it piss off the Democrats? That is an extraordinarily dangerous way to evaluate power. Because a politician who understands that dynamic receives virtually unlimited freedom. He does not need to explain why an action was ethical. He only needs to identify the people who objected to it. Then the objection becomes the defense. The more alarmed the opposition becomes, the more loyal the supporters feel they must remain. And once loyalty is measured by how much misconduct you are willing to excuse, accountability starts looking like betrayal. And this is not unique to conservatives. Liberals can defend politicians they like. They can minimize stories that complicate, our preferred narrative. We can mistake criticism of our side for support for the other side. Confirmation bias is part of the standard human equipment package. But acknowledging that doesn't require pretending the present scale is equal. MAGA and Trumpism has turned personal loyalty into a central political virtue. Republicans who question him are labeled as traitors. Officials who resist him are purged. Institutions that investigate him are declared illegitimate. And supporters are repeatedly told that defending Trump is the same thing as defending themselves and their country and their very way of life. That makes every allegation emotionally expensive to consider. Admitting one serious failure can feel like pulling on a loose thread from an entire identity. So the explanation changes. Fake news, perfectly legal, normal business, presidential authority, Democrats are worse. The conclusion remains untouched, and for people who genuinely lack reliable information, I can understand how this happens. What is much harder to accept is when it comes from people who absolutely know how evidence and conflicts of interest and consistent standards are supposed to work. The people who frustrate me the least are the ones that simply don't know. They're living in a media bubble and they're getting bad information. And, I can work with that, I guess. If somebody has honestly never heard about the conflicts of interest and the access and the pardons and the business arrangements and the weekend oversight, then there is at least somewhere to begin. You could attempt to show them the facts. You can compare sources. You can explain why an arrangement raises ethical concerns, even if no prosecutor has filed charges. Maybe they listen, maybe they don't. But ignorance can be corrected. What really pisses me off are the people who do know better. The lawyers, the accountants, the engineers, the business owners, the people who've built careers on critical thinking and good judgment, because they know exactly how they'd react if a Democratic president had done a fraction of these things. A lawyer understands conflict of interest. An accountant understands why money trails matter. An engineer understands that repeated failures point towards a system problem, not a series of unrelated coincidences. A business owner understands that you don't hand contracts and favors or access to people with personal relationships to the decision maker and then act shocked when others question the process. These are not people incapable of recognizing the standard. They apply it every day to one degree or another. They just seem to suspend it when the subject becomes Donald Trump. And that's why this conversation really has very little to do with intelligence. Intelligence does not eliminate denial. Sometimes intelligence just produces more sophisticated excuses. A smart person can take a conclusion they are emotionally committed to and build a big, beautiful legal brief around it. They can explain why this conflict is not technically prohibited, why that pardon falls within constitutional authority, why this donor relationship doesn't meet the criminal definition of bribery, why that business arrangement can't be proven to have influenced the policy decision. Every sentence may sound careful, every distinction may be technically accurate, and the entire argument may still be designed to avoid the obvious question sitting in the middle of the room. Would you accept this explanation from the other side? Because intellectual integrity is not the ability to invent a defense. It is the willingness to test that defense against your own standards. It's being able to say, yes, I voted for him. Yes, I still support some of his policies, but this was wrong. That should not be an impossible sentence. But in modern politics, admitting your side did something wrong is often treated as surrender. People fear that if they concede one point, the entire structure will collapse. If they admit Trump acted unethically here, maybe they were wrong to trust him there. Maybe the critics were right about something else. Maybe the people they mocked were not hysterical after all. So they just keep defending and defending and defending. Not always because the evidence is weak, sometimes because the personal cost of accepting that evidence just feels way too high. And I understand the psychology of that. What I cannot respect is the decision to make loyalty more important than honesty. Integrity is not measured by how aggressively you prosecute the other team. That's easy. Anyone can spot corruption when it wears the opposing party's campaign button. Integrity is measured most clearly by how honestly we judge our own side. That's the test. And yes, liberals fail it too. We should say so when we do. If a Democratic president enriches family members, rewards donors, interferes with investigations, sells access, or uses public power for private benefit, I do not want a clever progressive explanation for why it's secretly fine. I want accountability. Not because I enjoy damaging my own political side, because principles that only apply to opponents are not principles, they're weapons. And this disappointment really does come from expecting more. I expect more from people who know how evidence works. I expect more from people who teach their children that character matters. I expect more from people who run companies and manage employees and review contracts and balance books and interpret laws and solve complicated problems for a living. I'm not looking for perfection. I'm not looking for simple agreement with me, just consistency. The willingness to apply the same ethical test even when the answer is politically inconvenient. Democracy can't function if the smartest people in the room use their intelligence only to build better excuses for the powerful. At that point, knowledge is no longer protecting accountability. It's just helping power to escape it. So where does that leave us? Not with the claim that every item on Chris Murphy's timeline is equally serious, not with the claim that every ethical concern is a crime, and not with the claim that corruption belongs exclusively to one political party. Certainly not. It leaves us with the simpler question. Do we still believe in standards when applying them becomes uncomfortable? Because that is what this episode has really been about. Not Trump's personality, not Chris Murphy's politics, not whether Democrats are pure. They're not. It is about whether facts are allowed to matter more than loyalty. When a president's private business interests overlap with public power, we should ask questions. When donors receive access, or favors, or pardons, or contracts, or whatever, we should examine the sequence. When relatives and allies stand to profit from government decisions, we should demand transparency. And when the same types of explanations appear over and over and over again, we should stop pretending every controversy exists inside its own little vacuum-sealed container. Patterns matter, and scale matters, and consistency matters. That doesn't mean I'm saying rush to judgment. It means refusing to abandon judgment altogether. There is a difference between saying, I need more evidence, and saying, no amount of evidence could ever change my mind. One is skepticism. The other is just loyalty dressed up for Halloween. The defenses we have talked about today are not always completely false. Everybody does engage in questionable behavior sometimes. Something can be legal. A president does have pardon authority. A businessman does have financial interest. The media can make mistakes. But when every defense exists solely to protect the same conclusion, it stops functioning as an explanation and becomes an escape hatch. The explanation changes, but the conclusion never does. And that's the death of accountability. Not always a dramatic constitutional crisis. Sometimes it disappears one rationalization at a time. One conflict dismissed, one donor explained away, one pardon shrugged off, until eventually the standard is no longer ethical conduct. The standard is whether the person doing it belongs to your team. That's not principle, that's permission. And democracy can't survive indefinitely on permission structures built around powerful people. It simply can't. It requires citizens willing to ask hard questions of their opponents, but even more importantly, it requires citizens willing to ask hard questions of their allies. So the next time a political scandal breaks, try one simple test. Take the name out of the headline. Replace it with the name of someone from the other party. And then ask yourself, would I still be defending this? Would I still be demanding more evidence? Would I still be calling it perfectly legal? Would I still be writing it off as everyone does it? Because if the answer changes with the name, then the standard was never really a standard. It was just loyalty. And loyalty, it may be useful to a politician, but integrity is what democracy needs from the rest of us. All right, everyone. Thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to download and listen to this episode of Your Neighbor on the Left. I am thrilled that you did. I would love to hear from you. As I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, you can use the website. There are several avenues where you can reach out to the podcast. Let me know what you think about this topic or any other topic that I've talked about recently or not so recently. I will be back on Wednesday with another episode of Your Neighbor on the Left. So between now and then, stay engaged, stay kind, and have the kind of week you'd wish for others.